Hi, I'm Scott Hanselman. I'm here with Glenn Condren here at
Howdy.
Virtual Academy. This is another module. We've done the empty site.
We did.
We've done the Hello World. Talked a little bit about middleware in ASP.NET 5, just a taste of the relationship between Visual Studio, the browser, and the web server.
Yeah, a little bit about what Visual Studio is and isn't, and a little bit about what even mentioned Visual Studio Code. That's good.
Remember, you can go and get Visual Studio at visualstudio.com/free. You get the community edition. In this module, we're going to talk about Model View Controller, the pattern.
Yeah.
Because you hear about MVC a lot.
Yes.
Model View Controller is something that you see in Ruby on Rails, and you see in Python and PHP and ASP.NET. Lots of different web frameworks use this pattern.
Yes, they do, and non-web frameworks even built Windows Forms applications using a variant of the Model View Controller pattern.
And we're going to launch Visual Studio, and instead of making an empty app, we're going to use the default template.
Yes, and we're going to spend some time walking through it, I believe, to just show you the stuff that you've got, and then we'll make some changes as we go.
Right, and we're going to use docs.asp.net, which is our open source, continuously updated documentation site, and we're going to run through a tutorial or two there and walk you through them, and I am playing the role of newbie.
Yes. So one of the things I wanted to achieve here is I spent some time learning Node. And so I did what I thought I should do, which was I went and grabbed a Yeoman generator, and I generated me a big site. For those of you who haven't done any of this stuff, don't worry about it. Yeoman
Node is another web
Node is another web framework, and Yeoman generators just make you a site similarly to when you click File New in Visual Studio. And my problem when I was learning this stuff was I didn't know what anything did or where everything was. There was just these hundreds of files, thousands of files, something. And then I realized that the only reason that I don't feel that way when I do File New in Visual Studio is because I already know what all of this stuff does. So what I wanted to achieve here, to begin with at least, was trying to make you feel better about what was in all that generated stuff, so you knew what a lot of it was, so you felt like you could use it instead of feeling overwhelmed by all of this content that we threw at you when you just clicked File New.
Right, and when you're starting with something, when you're a beginner, and we throw a lot of things at you, one of the things that's difficult to understand is how deep should you go?
Yeah, the eternal question, how low in the stack do I need to know? Do I need to know about assembly
Right. So he just said the stack, right?
Yeah.
From the web server, the socket that got opened, and HTTP, and all these things in the stack, that can be very overwhelming as a new web developer.
Absolutely.
Or as a new web developer coming to a new stack, a new framework like ASP.NET.
Yeah, and as much as possible, we try to know about all of that stuff that's below your application code, so that as much as possible, you don't have to know about it. You can if you want to know about it. And now it's possible because you can look at all of our source code, which is also amazing. But yeah, we'll try and show you things that you may probably need to know, or maybe is good to know, and leave the rest of it to be maybe you need to know it in the future if you're interested.
So in the first module, we did a Hello World that was a piece of middleware that just said Hello World, and that's all it did. But it really wasn't clear how you would build in interactivity and how you would return HTML and have a real web application. And we're going to show an app that is going to include, on top of ASP.NET, MVC, Model View Controller.
Yeah, and it's the name of the product.
So let's take a look at Visual Studio. And I'm going to say new project again, which we did before, and I'm going to pick web application, and we'll say
a new name,
MVA, that is Microsoft Virtual Academy, MVC.
Yeah, there's not many acronyms at all.
And when I'm going to click on web application again. Now here's an important thing. If you're following along, you're trying to do this yourself, over on the side here it says change authentication.
Yeah.
By default, ASP.NET and Visual Studio will set you up with this thing called individual user account authentication, which means that people can log into your site.
Yeah, and it actually that individual user account actually adds, I would say, the majority of the content from the new web application is to do authentication. So if you don't need authentication, or you're just learning and you just want to do some stuff, then you probably should click this.
Right. So you can click on this, and here's where you can choose. Do you want your application to be able to log into your work account or your school account through Office 365? Do you want built-in authentication? Or no authentication for like a brochureware application?
Yeah, or just a public site that doesn't have anything secure in it.
Right. So we're going to click no authentication. This is going to make it easier for us because you will be able to not be so overwhelmed.
Yeah.
All this is doing, to be clear, is removing the authentication bits. It's not removing
there's just
anything.
some extra classes and there's some extra pages that you're not going to appear in here. Later on, in some later modules, we'll show you web applications that have authentication.
Yes.
And then so you will see all of that.
Exactly. And when we dig into the live.asp.net sample that Damien
Makes use
wrote,
of that. Yeah.
that will actually use authentication, and it'll use cloud-based authentication and talk to the company.
Yeah, the problem with the thing with authentication when we're trying to teach is that there's lots of concepts. It brings in a database to be able to store your username and password, so then there's a lot of mechanics to make that work. So we're just trying to make it simpler for you guys to understand by removing it.
All right, so I'm going to hit OK. And we're going to get something that's a little bit different than we saw with empty. Empty was pretty minimal.
Yeah, we have lots of debates on the team of how empty is empty.
Yeah, how empty is empty? It needs to be empty but functional.
Yeah.
Now, I've just paused this and I zoomed in. So this is paused. What's going on there?
So what's going on there is that we looked a little bit, we touched very briefly in the first module on that references node and how it had little NuGet packages in there, little blue icon with the white dots, right?
These are the packages. And you remember that in the first module, we had, if I remember, these two and static files. So these three.
Yeah. So when it says restoring there, what it's doing is going and getting all of these into your project. It's restoring them. Now, if this was you getting your own project, opening up your own project out of source control or copying it onto a machine for the first time, that might even be connecting to the internet and going and downloading all of these things and putting them into your application. So you don't have to, if you've got source control where you store all of your applications, you don't have to have all of these packages in there where you store your app. You can go and get them when you need them on your machine,
so
right?
You're saying that there's a kind of a cafeteria plan here in our application. It says I want a little bit of this,
a little bit of that. Exactly.
But that's coming from our in the cloud repository of packages. It's a library that you can choose from.
So yes, technically when you do file new, we don't actually hit the internet.
So there's a library locally, so I can even do this on an airplane.
Yes. So
okay, cool.
Because we basically pre-install all the stuff that you need for the file new templates with Visual Studio. But in general, think of this as going to the internet and getting any of the pieces that I've said I need for my application to work.
So there's more things here now that we have an MVC application. We've got not just the things that serve static files, but we can see here's probably MVC. Some things that are going to be used for diagnostics, and as it relates to diagnostics, being able to do logging.
Yep, and we've got some configuration in there to be able to set some settings.
And we'll have a little module on configuration and logging as well.
Yep.
There's a thing called browser link that we'll talk about a little bit later. And then Razor is what you use to write your HTML and the tooling that allows that to happen.
Yeah.
So what it looks like a lot, it's about separation of concerns.
Yeah, to steal a phrase that some guy on the internet said, there's the appropriately sized Lego pieces, right?
Yeah, it is like snapping Lego pieces together, and these are all well-sized Lego pieces. But the great thing also is that you can just close that up and not really worry about it.
Yeah, you can. If all you're doing is what we're doing. Yeah.
So I see my www root. I see my project JSON, which we haven't actually opened, but we know
but we know it exists.
Yeah. I see my project README.
Just like before, same one.
The startup is there. I think I want to look at that.
It's going to be different this time.
Okay, and then I see two new folders. So let's open up startup, and then let's figure out what's going on with these folders.
Yeah.
So here's startup. Whoops.
It's huge.
There we go. So I've got a bunch of using statements. Those are saying I want to use these things over here.
Yep.
Right. Here's startup. I'm going to make this a little larger. So this is, let me see here. Got quite a little bit more going on here.
Yeah,
Let's
and
see
this
what's
is heavily commented, right, to try and teach as well as provide usefulness, right?
So on startup, when startup happens,
we have a constructor of our startup class.
Okay. So this is the constructor.
Yes.
And here we're going to say we're going to build some configuration. We'll talk about that in a configuration module.
Yep.
So it looks like we're going to get some configuration from a JSON file, and we're going to build that.
Yeah.
So this section here we'll talk about when we talk about configuration.
That's fine. And then we got configure services.
This is configure and configure services.
Configure services is definitely new. It's not something that many, even existing ASP.NET customers are necessarily familiar with. And we'll talk about that in a minute. I think, in this module.
Okay.
And then configure is the thing we looked at before, where we configure our application pipeline, right?
Right, and just like before in our configure, we had use static files.
Yeah.
And we had run.
App.run.
So now we've got some logging, which makes sense because we added a logger.
Yep.
We've got this thing called browser link that we'll talk about. It looks like we have error pages.
Yeah, which is nice.
Yeah.
Might be nice if we did cause errors to happen.
There's use static files, so that's there by default.
Yep.
And then now, because this is an MVC application, we've got MVC being added.
Yeah, and some routing, which we also talk about in more detail later.
Okay.
So there's a like a mini life cycle of sorts in Startup CS that might be important for you to understand one day. There's a constructor, and there's a configure services, and there's a configure. And they get called in an order, right?
Okay. So let's talk about that. So when startup runs, this is the very first time.
Yeah, just like any other type, just like any other C# thing, it has to be constructed. So the constructor runs, right? Your constructor happens.
Okay, so it gets made.
Yeah, it gets made, which means that config thing that we created in the constructor, it's always there for the other methods because it has to be. It's the way C# works, right?
Then you said configure?
And then configure services. And then configure. All right. Now I bring this up because people seem to. It's somewhat important, and it helps you if you understand briefly that order, then we can talk about what they do, and it kind of helps you make sense of where everything fits in the world.
So later we might go and add things to that.
Maybe, yeah. So configure services. Do you want to talk about it now? We can briefly talk about it.
Very briefly. Okay, I want to talk about MVC.
Configure services is where we put all of the things that your application might need to use later on. So we put if we look at it now, actually, we have probably add MVC.
Okay, let's take a look at that.
To make MVC
Oh, I
work.
see what you're saying.
Right.
This is where this is my library of stuff. So MVC is the thing I'm going to use, so I add it.
You add all the services, you add all the classes and types and code that MVC is going to need to run, right?
Add MVC.
And use MVC.
And use MVC.
Yeah, people ask, why do I repeat myself in here?
I see, but what you're doing is you're saying, I want this to be available optionally.
Yep.
And then you choose to use it or not use it.
Yeah, but whether or not you've chosen to add a whole bunch of services doesn't mean that any given request is going to have to use those, right?
Oh, interesting.
So when you say add MVC, you could add MVC and not use MVC, and you would just never use any of the things that you just added, right? So when you're saying use MVC, you're saying when a request comes in, you're saying I'm going to redirect some of these requests to MVC, and when that happens, a whole bunch of the stuff that I added in when I said add gets used.
I see. Right? So static files is something that's out there that I'm using, but I'm only using it when I want to serve a static file. Exactly. Otherwise, it doesn't even get in the request.
Yeah, and this stuff will more detail will come with this later. Mm-hmm. Just thought I'd give you a little brief. Into this, because if you start to try and play along as you're watching this, you might get a little bit confused and you might see these multiple things, and it'll help you understand.
But the thing that I think is important is that add MVC, the model view controller pattern, got added.
And then I'm using it.
And then use MVC got set up as well.
Yeah, and they're kind of distinct from each other.
Okay.
And we can talk about the benefit of some of those a lot. I'm assuming later on we'll talk about why it's important to have that separation and how you might use those methods yourself and things like that, but not right now.
All right, cool. So then we've got these two new folders here.
Controllers and views.
Controllers and views. So let's look at these. We'll do a run, we'll set a debug point, and then we'll look at some boxes and lines, because this is a big concept.
Yeah, we're just going to hit F5?
So there's a home controller and some home views. So let's see home get served.
Yeah, let's see home get served, yeah.
All right.
So when you're pressing play here, like we talked about earlier on, your little IIS Express box should appear down the bottom, and it's going to...
There it is.
Yeah, and it's going to host your application. And
now this is a new application, so you can see it got a new port number.
Yep. We should say too that when you're running this thing, only you can talk to it.
Oh, that's an interesting point. So my computer has a different name than localhost, but you have another computer in front of you there. You can't connect to localhost.
No, I can't connect to that port.
And I can't make IIS Express serve this outside.
So IIS Express, as different from IIS, will only let you have like local applications that you can't browse from outside of your machine. So you can't, ping your coworker and say, hey, browse to this thing that I just pressed F5 on in IIS Express. If you
one other interesting thing about IIS Express worth pointing out is that you can certainly run multiple sites within it.
Yeah.
If you had sites that talk to each other.
Yeah.
And I could also go and turn them off and things like that as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so here is my default page, and it looks like I've got a little
little thing telling you about
carousel here and some concepts. So this is kind of like that project README.
A little bit, yeah.
But it's a little more active. I've also got a menu, so I see home, about, and contact me. And I'm noticing when I switch between those, my URL changes. So I've got, I clicked on contact and I hit /home/contact. But I noticed though that I'm only seeing home about, there we go, home about and home contact. So, if I typed in like home/Scott, I get a 404, I get a not found. So there is no Scott.
There is no Scott.
And if I say, let's say /Scott/about, that doesn't exist either. So home and contact and home about is all that I've got there.
Yeah.
Okay. So what happened? Let's look at our Server Explorer again and open up the home controller. Now, just for your information, I'm hitting Shift, Alt, Enter, and I'm doing that to make all the other stuff go away, because sometimes I just want to look at my code.
Yeah.
The other thing that I like to do is I like to hold down Control and do Scroll, Control Scroll. And that's certainly useful for you all at home, but also nice on my giant monitor. So we've got public class home controller is a controller, or derives from controller.
Indeed.
Index. Now I didn't see anything called index
No.
when I said /home.
You didn't, but put a breakpoint there?
A breakpoint. So I can hit F9 or I can click over here.
For those of you who are maybe not necessarily familiar with this, you can, in Visual Studio, use breakpoints to stop code running when it gets to that spot, and you can look around and inspect things, right?
So I've just put a breakpoint here at that location.
Yeah, and now when you press F5, or if you press the play button, F5 is the shortcut for the green play button.
Right.
Then when this index thing gets hit, it'll stop.
Okay, so the page is still blank.
The page is still blank because what's happening here is we talked a little bit about the separation between server and client here, and about the web server running my code and the browser hitting the server. So in this case, what we've done is that because that return view is yellow, when the browser has sent a request to the server, IIS Express has started to run the ASP.NET code to return the response, and we've just stopped it in the middle, and it can't finish returning.
So as far
the
as
browser is just waiting.
As far as the browser is concerned, it's just taking a really long time.
This is just a really slow site.
And as I understand it, I think it'll wait for a couple of minutes.
It'll wait for a while, and eventually I think it'll time out.
Longer than it would in production.
Yeah.
So it hasn't returned the page yet.
No.
We hit just the default.
Which was just slash, right?
So that means that index must be the default.
Yes.
And you had talked about call stacks.
Yeah, I did talk. Did I? Yeah, I talked about the stack. Yeah.
So if I go down here and click on call stack, I can see a lot of
stuff.
Scary stuff here.
Yeah.
I thought there was a way to make it look less scary. Isn't there a way to say don't show everyone else's scary code?
Not showing all the native code, just showing my code.
This is the stack, but it's scarier than it really needs to be.
It really is, yeah.
I wanted to make it, I forgot how to do this.
It's my code only thing, right?
Yeah, I think it's called is that what it's called? Just my code?
Okay.
Just my code?
There's another thing that, whilst he's looking for this, that quick search box up the top right there is amazing.
Ah, look at that. Yeah, so this is a funny thing that you're just pointing out. Yeah. No one uses this, and it's just a tragedy. It really is. Yeah. If I go up into the corner here, it's called Quick Launch. If you're a new person who's just getting started, this is your Bing, this is your Google for
everything
Visual Studio. So I remembered there was a feature called Just My Code.
Yeah.
One of the funny things that happens is you'll talk to a person who's maybe a little more advanced than you. You say, I want to change my font sizes. And they'll be like, tools, options, environments, text, and it's like, whoa, I just want to change my font sizes. So you just go up here and you just type font, and then hit enter, and it actually takes you right there.
Yep.
So rather than running around looking for stuff, just type it. So I want to, just my code is what I wanted to see. Just my code,
Yep, and then you got the setting.
and I went there and I turned it on. And now look at my call stack.
Yeah.
Now it's like framework code and my code are not quite so scary. So that's very comforting, and we'll see that change as we
go
along.
Yeah. So what's happening here is that when this index method of your home controller is the thing that gets returned when you go to / of your site in this configuration of ASP.NET.
Right. Now I can, with my debugging toolbar here, step over, go to the next line.
Yep.
Okay.
And that's it. That should be it for this request.
And I can see that was a very short maneuver, did not take any time at all, and we returned something, some action, some result from this, and I hit F5.
Yep. F5 is also the just continue running button as well.
Exactly.
If you're debugging. So now, eventually, assuming we haven't hit some timeout somewhere, then this should.
Yeah, we waited a really long time.
We spent a long time talking with that breakpoint going.
I don't think that we probably should have waited so long.
Maybe not. Maybe it doesn't like us waiting for quite so long. So
I'm going to do that again, and I'm not going to wait for 4 minutes like I did. All right.
Okay.
So we go and hit, there we go, and now hit continue.
And so.
And then we're back.
And then we're good. So this / returns to there. So we should. There's two things we can do here. We can.
But where's the page though? Like, let's talk about that. Let's
Where's
figure
the
out
page?
this process.
Okay,
I just hit /.
Okay,
But wait
yeah.
a second though. Actually, I noticed that I can hit home about.
Yeah.
This is called index. Can I type home index?
I mean,
there isn't.
We're about
there
to find out, right? Look at that.
Ah, there we go. Okay, so let me hit F5. Continue. Right. So this home index is the default.
It is the
It's
default.
the same.
Yeah, home index is the default, and you're in a breakpoint now, so nothing is happening.
So I typed /home/index. We're sitting here at that breakpoint.
Yeah.
And I'll hit continue.
And you're at index.
And then we're at index again. Okay.
Yeah.
So home is the controller and index is the method.
it is the method. It is also the view.
Ah, so there's a view. So let's look at that. So if we go to the Solution Explorer,
We want to stop.
I'm going to go ahead and stop debugging.
It's just right above your solution for some reason if you're not used to it being there. The little toolbar. Next time you click play.
Okay. So index is here in views. So there's this relationship.
And it's in a folder called home, which is the same name as our controller.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And each of these, this is a convention, right?
Yeah. So MVC has a lot of conventions built in. You know, the fact that the home controller has controller at the end and it's in a folder called controllers means it's a controller. You know, the fact that there's a folder called views means that it's got views in it. And if the view is inside a folder called home, then it's meant for the home controller. These are the sorts of conventions that make MVC fast to get. It makes it fast to get an application up and running. Once you know the conventions, you drop the files in the right spots and things just work for you. There's no magic here. It's just, whilst it can seem like magic, it's just this is the way MVC is configured. Once you know that, everything is good.
Okay, so I said home, and then to be clear, this is a convention, but you have total control if you want to do it another way.
Yeah, you can change a lot. Even more so now in ASP.NET 5 than ever before, but yeah.
So I'm just typing this up just so I can understand it.
Yep.
And the idea, you can see how a great typist I am. It's pretty fantastic.
Yeah, think about how long it must take him to send all those emails every day.
It's pretty bad. So /home/index, we'll go through routing, is routed to the home controller, which then delegates to the index view.
Yes.
Okay, so this is where we get to go into a slide.
Excellent.
And think about this. So you're going to be impressed with my slides. They're classic MVC slides.
Yeah.
This is not, I think, the best slide. This is the kind of the thing that they always
It's the
show
one you always see when you look for MVC, though.
And I think it's kind of silly because whenever you search for MVC, you see a slide that looks like this, and your brain is supposed to go, oh, thank
that's
goodness.
amazing.
Three circles. That's way clearer. Model view controller.
Oh, how could I have been so silly? Model view controller, of course.
So let's look at it like this. This is MVC kind of in practice. So this slide here is slightly less.
Slightly less.
A request comes in this case it was /home/index. And the router, which we'll talk about later.
Which is middleware, which we talked about earlier.
Oh, it's just middleware. Good job. It looks at that request, figures out which controller is going to deal with that, and then it called that method.
Yeah.
So that index method got called. It wasn't me. I didn't type index,
Round
parentheses.
bracket, yeah.
Yeah, right. And then in the future, we'll see that it'll make a model. It'll go to a database. It'll do stuff. It'll do businessy stuff.
Businessy stuff. Doing business?
In this case, it didn't do anything. But it did want to make a view.
It did.
Or return a view. That
Apparently
view.
it gave it a briefcase.
The briefcase is the business.
The business. I see what you did there.
Yeah,
I like that.
thank you. Yeah, that's my business briefcase.
Yeah.
The stuff that the controller does, the result of what the controller does, gets passed into the view.
Yeah.
The view then does stuff with that and then turns that into HTML,
And
usually
gives it back to
HTML.
you. Generally HTML.
Could turn it into other stuff, but
It does, yeah. If we talk about web APIs and data and returning, we mentioned briefly returning JSON from your controllers earlier. You can do that as well, and then you're not necessarily returning HTML. But for those of you who are perhaps familiar with previous versions of ASP.NET, it used to always be HTML from an MVC application, and you would use a different product called web API to get JSON or something like that, but they're all the same.
right.
In ASP.NET
So
5,
we'll actually try to return a string and we'll try to return some HTML and we'll
Yeah.
return some JSON a little bit later.
Yeah, sounds
Cool.
great.
So then that gets transformed, and then the response that comes back is
It's an
what you
amazing
get.
pie chart.
You like that? I worked really hard on that.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. There's applause,
applause
from
from the gallery.
one person in the audience that cares. Thank you for that smattering of applause. Yeah.
When you get to this point, send a tweet to Scott saying applause. It'll
Applause?
be amazing.
That'll be nice. And now, for the next several years, there will be random applause tweets sent to me.
Yep,
Thank
and you will appreciate this moment every time.
All right, we'll get into the details about models and stuff like that in a second. So let's look at the code again, and I'm going to ask a couple of questions. This means, I bet, that I could go, and I'm just going to copy paste, because one of the great ways that you learn how to do things like this is by experimenting and copy pasting.
Yeah,
so I just copy
absolutely.
pasted that, and I'm going to call it foo.
Ooh, and you're going to return view.
Now, yeah, let's.
You don't really know what this return view does
I
yet,
have no
so
idea
this
what's
is-
going to happen.
This is the thing, right?
Right.
You're
So
going
I'm
to hit
gonna
your
hit
breakpoint
this.
again, probably.
Oh yeah, I'll turn off that breakpoint because I don't want to stop there anymore.
Yeah.
Okay, and we're going to hit, in this case, home index, but I'm going to type in /home/foo, an unhandled exception, the
Yeah.
blue screen of death, the light blue
This is the
screen of
new.
death.
This is the new beautiful screen of death.
The view foo was not found, but it tells me exactly where it was looking.
And you can see the conventions being kind of shown. If you didn't know anything about the conventions, you can see them being kind of given to you here, right? It's saying we don't have a view called foo.
Yep.
The locations we searched were /views/home/view.cs.html and views/shared. So now you know, and we didn't mention that shared before, but now you know that, oh, okay, in order for this thing to know about in order for the view to work, I have to put a file here called that, and then it'll return it.
Right, but it also
now I know
tells
what's
me
going
that
on.
it looked here first,
And then here.
and then it looked there second.
Yeah.
So in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, I can now share views.
Yes.
So I've
And
figured
shared
that out.
views,
I've
you worked
learned
it out.
that.
These are the things you would we spend lots of time trying to get these things so that we can help you learn in this manner. So
Right.
Don't be scared of error messages.
And a
Error
nice little
messages are great.
benefit too, by the way. We saw F12 tools in the first module. You're giving
We're
me
showing you that
headers and
stuff in here
cookies and things like
and
that.
stack. And if you were getting this error page because you'd made a code mistake, we would be able to start to see those sorts of things in here, and it would be helpful for you.
Okay, cool. So view foo worked. So then I bet, can I come over here and say add a new view? I'm going to right click, say add new item. And here we go, MVC view page
Yeah. Foo.
called foo. Hit add.
And then what's it got in it? It's got nothing. It's great.
Hey,
Hello.
I'm foo. Pretty sophisticated here.
Scott is single-handedly trying to change "Hello World" into "Hello, I am Foo."
Yes, why not? So let's go ahead and bring that up. And
Yeah. So now we know that this thing is going to look in this spot. So theoretically, it's going to work, right?
and this is
Look at that.
interesting though. I said, hey, I'm foo, but look, I got a menu still.
Yeah. It's amazing.
All right, so where's
How did that happen?
menu coming from?
Well, let's have a look at the solution and find out, shall we?
Okay,
So we know now that shared is a thing
because it looked at
because it
shared
looked
as an
at shared
alternative, right?
as an alternative to foo. What's in shared? And we have a thing called layout.
So we've got layout and error. Well, it's clearly not error, so it must be layout. Let's
hope.
go look in there.
Look at that.
And
There's stuff everywhere.
I'm going to stop debugging
Yeah.
again.
Yep.
and I'm going to make this bigger. We're going to go into things like environment a little bit later, so we're going to actually ignore that. And one of the things when you're learning, a learning tool here, if you want to hide those because they're just emotionally too much to handle, you can totally do that, and they're still there.
Yeah,
they're just hidden.
You can even create your own for that code that you wish you didn't write, but you had.
Right. Now here I see my menu. Look at that. There's my nav bar, and I'm going to just, as one does,
copy and
paste because I'm learning.
Absolutely.
I want to have a.
Now your controller is still home because we're still in that home class,
foo.
right?
All right. So
and
I'm going to just
you
call it
create
foo.
a thing called view. Yeah.
And this is going to make an anchor, a link in HTML, and that link is going to happen to call home, and then the foo action, and then I'm going to hit save.
And we'll talk about why this is purple and why it's got ASP-specific stuff in it later on when we talk about tag hoppers.
But it's nice and discoverable.
Yeah. But for now, this generates an A tag, just like it says. It's just a little bit special because it knows a little bit about MVC, is what all of this is really telling.
So there's foo.
There's foo. What happens when you click it?
Boom.
And what's the URL? Same as what we were typing in before.
home/foo.
Yeah.
So here's a question, though. What if I just, instead of saying go and get a view, is this possible? Can I go hello foo?
First, does it compile?
Well, so it's squiggly.
Why is it
And it's saying I can't make a string into an action result.
Seems to make sense. A string isn't an action result.
Well, I know it's a string, so what if I just say string?
Seems to go.
So now it compiled.
Now what happens if you press play?
Let's see.
Does the VCR explode?
Can I just return a string?
Can you just return a string? Yeah.
Do you know? Let's find out.
We're going to find out.
Dun, dun, dun. And home foo. I'm going to hit foo.
Look at that.
So I can return just a string. I'm presuming that it turned into a view or whatever it needed to turn into.
Can we press F12?
Yeah, let's do F12. What did we get? What did we end up returning? Let's hit refresh again. Interesting. Look at that.
Text plain.
So it's not HTML, it's plain text, which could be useful if I wanted to return plain text, or I could maybe change that and be a comma-separated value. Or
or you could say you want to return, a JSON or something. So this is MVC knowing that you're returning a string. So if you're returning a string, you must be returning text plain, right?
Okay. So it knew that I was returning a string here because I said
you're returning
as a return value I was returning a string.
Yeah.
Interesting, okay. And we'll see later when we talk about web APIs how we can return things like JavaScript and other things. Even in the graphic if you wanted to potentially return a graphic.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's going on here though in about? Because in about it says your application description page. Now I'm going to show you a little trick here. Instead of hitting this button, which you notice takes a little bit of time. There's a couple of seconds of kind of wasted time. I can go and say start debugging or start without debugging.
And it shows you the shortcuts here for F5 and Control F5, right?
Right, and I like Control F5. It's a really nice one. This is going to launch the browser without debugging, and it tends to start up a little faster because it doesn't have to load so much.
So the reason for this is that, and the distinction here is earlier on we had a breakpoint, and when we hit index it would hit a breakpoint. If Scott was to put his breakpoint back and then press Control F5, it wouldn't hit anymore.
So I put a breakpoint there. I'm on about, but we're not debugging, so the breakpoint doesn't happen.
So the reason it takes a little bit longer to start up is because it starts up IIS Express and then Visual Studio is what it calls attaches. It attaches to the thing that it just started up so that it can do things like hit breakpoints and have you inspect what's going on and things like that.
Look at my variables.
Look at my variables and stuff. So Control F5 is always going to be faster because there's a whole lot less work that we have to do to set up debugging, but it also means that you can't debug.
Right, but it's just good to know that that's available.
Yeah, absolutely. And Control F5 is probably what you want most of the time, unless you actually are trying to explicitly step through code. Control F5 is probably what you want.
Right. So here's another tip. I've been using the mouse mostly. We've talked about quick launch and how useful that is, and how if you get one thing out of this entire thing, even though the whole presentation is all about introduction to ASP.NET.
And everything that we say is valuable.
Please use the quick launch. It'll change your life.
Quick launch will change your life. I was amazed.
But another really great feature that not enough people use is control, comma.
Yeah?
And if I want to go and type in about, because I want to go and get the about page, I can just type about and open it. So that saves me moving my mouse. So I just opened up about. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click here and I'm going to say new horizontal tab group.
Yeah.
And what I'm doing is I want to do a split screen here to just make a point. So we've got home about right there,
Yeah.
your application description page. That's the text that appears
Yep.
right there.
Yeah.
But then use this area to provide additional information. That appears here. So I'm going to change that if that's okay with you. I'm just going to say I am in the About view.
In all caps.
Because all caps is where it's at. And
If you could make it Comic Sans, I'm sure he would have.
I am in the home controller. Such a good typist. I type 100 words a minute, but 90 is errors. Now, can I just hit refresh? Will that actually happen, or do I need to compile first?
You don't. Well, you do need to compile first, but
Do I?
we did it for you.
So compiling does happen. Compiling is building this code into binaries that can be understood by the computer, but you did it for me because Visual Studio noticed
Yeah.
that I made the change.
Yeah, so Visual Studio knew you made the change, and actually, type in the box again.
In here?
Yep. And for those of you who are watching, watch the little blue thing down the bottom right, the thing we looked at, the IIS Express icon. See it, go away, and come back.
Oh, wow, look at that. Let me try that again. So I'm going to hit save. I'm not going to do it yet. We're looking right here.
Yep,
There's
Control-
IS
and then we're
Express.
just
I'm going to
gonna
hit
hit Control
Control
S.
S.
And then, now it's going to take its time. Did you save?
Of course, because you asked it to.
Yeah, because I asked it to work. But
Did it?
you'll see it flash.
flashes?
Sometimes it flashes so fast that you don't even actually really realize that it goes away and it's come back.
But it did.
But it did, and that's what's happening there. Is visual. We're noticing that you've changed the code and it needs to be recompiled. So it's basically restarting the web server and recompiling everything and restarting it for you on the fly. And then when you refresh,
see.
it's a new web server basically.
And what's nice about that, if you're coming at this from a PHP perspective or a Node perspective or even Rails, you're used to edit code, hit refresh, edit code, hit refresh.
But the problem, I guess, the difference between those kind of interpreted languages where you just take the code and you don't have, and then you run it through the thing and it does what it's got to do. With C# and these compiled languages is you need to take the source code and turn it into something else that can be run on the computer that you need to run on. The interpreted languages do that as well, but they are designed to do that on the fly as you are executing the code. Whereas with these ones, there's a step beforehand, which is compile. So we're trying to give you the experience that you expect on a development machine by editing the code and refreshing the browser, but doing it for you in a language that isn't designed that way from the beginning.
Okay.
And it's it works pretty well.
It works very nicely.
Yeah.
So I see here there's a thing called view data
Yeah.
in the controller where I'm putting it into this kind of this bag of stuff.
Yes.
So guessing again, because we're learning here,
Yeah.
I bet you I could go and say foo message. This is custom. Such a good typer.
Yeah.
So this is custom. So I just put that in there.
Yeah.
And this bag, how long does that live? Does that live long enough for me to use it in the view now?
Well, if you go into the view, you can see message being used right there, right?
Right. So then I'll go and say I'll make another paragraph.
Yeah.
Or actually, and again, this is just HTML, so I could say block quote at view data, and it's the at that switched me into
code mode. So what you're doing here is generating this bottom pane here, this CS HTML. This is called Razor.
So this is Razor.
This is the stuff this is like a templating language the template that is going to generate the HTML for you. That's going to become HTML.
So let's take a look. So I'm going to hit F5. This is custom. There's my block quote. I can right click and say view source.
But you're not going to see Razor here.
Right. I will see the result.
Because by the time it gets to the browser, it's all HTML.
So, content, there he is. So their block quote.
Now, do you notice something happening behind him
So
there?
I'm clicking around here.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm clicking around in F12 Tools.
Yeah.
And it's actually, well, that's really cool. So if I click right there on block quote.
Yeah, it shows you the block quote.
Well, not only that, it went to the code that made the thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me try something crazy here because I want to make sure I really understand this. Help me write a for loop.
At
For.
So you've got some little snippets there too, like
Wait a second. I don't even have to, that's even easier.
At for. You see?
tab.
Yeah, look at that.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to do that 10 times. Very good for beginners.
Yeah.
I'm going to take this block quote, I'm going to stick it in here. It even indented it for me, which is lovely.
Yeah.
I'm going to make this 10 times. And let's hit refresh. This is custom 10 times.
Yeah.
Nice.
Incredibly useful.
Right click. Now, before I said view source, I can actually say inspect element.
You can. And look at that, it takes you straight to there in the source code.
Takes me there in the source code, and as I'm clicking on all of these,
It's just showing you the code.
it's showing me the for loop,
Yeah.
which is really nice. Now, if I click about,
Yeah.
it shows me where that code came from.
Yeah.
If I hit block quote, it shows me that code came
And
from.
what's doing this? Do you know?
So this is browser link.
Yeah.
This is the thing that we talked about earlier in startup.cs. We commented about.
In our dependencies, we said we're adding this browser link thing. Right in our list on the side, we mentioned it, and that's what it's achieving. This. Yeah.
Now, if people may be familiar with previous versions of Visual Studio where we had a thing called the Page Inspector
Yes.
that allowed you to do a similar feature, that's now built into the browser.
Yeah, and you can see some of the things with browser link. If you close your divs and stuff here,
Close my divs.
in there. Sorry, you can see down the bottom there a thing called browser link, right?
Right, and this only happens when you're running under iOS Express in the context of Visual Studio.
Yeah.
When you go into production, of course, that's not going to be there.
Yeah, but so these sorts of features seem like magic. So I wanted to point that out, that like this is where writing code that makes this happen, and the way it works is by injecting this into your page, and that helps wire up Visual Studio and your page. And so as you do things on the page, you can talk to Visual Studio.
And that's a great reminder that while it feels like magic, it is just the web.
Yeah.
And in a new world where Microsoft products are open source, where they embrace the web, in this context, you can go and look at this JavaScript. None of it's hidden from you.
Yeah.
None of this is a black box.
I mean, some of it might be hard, some of it might be complicated code, but it's still code that you could, if you wanted to, spend the time to learn and understand.
So we're going to come back and talk in more detail. Right now, we've just passed data from the controller to the view using
Via the view data.
view data. We put in strings. You can put in objects, date times, and ints and things like that.
So that where we added that stuff to the view data was your business, right?
I guess it was. Let's take a look at
your
that really
business?
quick. So going back here, this could have come out of the database.
It could have.
That could have called a web service or gone to YouTube or
Yeah, it
whatever.
could have grabbed the latest finance data and generated a pie chart.
Yep. And then when we in our foo rather, I think we changed
We're
it.
playing about.
We were in about
down the bottom there.
In about there at the bottom, we had some code. So we mixed a little bit of code, but this code was view specific code.
Yes.
So then if we look at the slides, so the models hold that data. Those are called models. So when we say model view controller, in this case, we didn't have a models
We didn't really.
file.
We were kind of taking advantage of view data to be like just a cheap, easy way
A cheap
to do.
model.
Yeah, a cheap
there you
model.
go. So the models hold the data. That's how the controllers and the views communicate. And that model, it was just data. It didn't hold any business. They didn't have any knowledge. It was just here. You're the view. This is what it looks like.
Yeah, and then the view decides, okay, he gave me a model. How do I make this thing appear on the page? What is the HTML that I need to generate in order to have this model appear to the user?
Exactly. Now, more advanced techniques, if you look at this slide here, you could have, in this case, I reused models. Like if I got a person object, I could then give that to the view and immediately display it. But in more sophisticated instances, when we talk about advanced techniques, you could have a view model,
You could have a view model, yeah.
which would be a model that is specific for the view. And we'll get a little bit more into detail on that.
So in that world, sometimes you have a model for your representing kind of your entire world of your application, but the view that you happen to be rendering right now only needs some small amount of that of all the data that you generated whilst you were doing calculations. So in that world, you would maybe create a view model just specific to the view that you happen to be using right now, but you still make use of all of these other things to generate all the data that you needed just for that one thing.
Right.
It's cutting down on how much you're sending, how much you're processing at any given time, right?
So we're going to take a short break, and we're going to come back. We're going to do a little bit more sophisticated model, going through one of the one of the docs.asp.net samples.
Yes.
Then we'll talk about Bootstrap, because we haven't talked about that. Like that site was kind of pretty.
Yeah, it was pretty. It's pretty by
free.
default. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty by default.
2 notes that I forgot to mention earlier that I should mention before we end on this note. When you do Control F5, when you do the edit in the browser and refresh, if you press F5 instead of Control F5, it won't work the way you expect.
Okay, what does that mean?
Because when you press F5, the debugger attaches to IIS, and that means that we can't really kill it all and start it up again and compile it for you in the background. So when Scott was pressing Control F5, he was kind of incidentally he was pressing Control F5 because it was fast. But common problem people have when trying to reproduce that is that they press F5 instead of Control F5. And when you're pressing F5, the debugger's attached, and that makes it hard for us to do. So we can't really make that work the way that you want it to.
So if I can paraphrase, what you're saying is that if I run without the debugger, I get the convenience of being able to change code and hit refresh.
Yes.
But if I run with the debugger, because that has a
the
lot
whole
of
debugger has to run and do
business
stuff.
starts up, you can't edit and hit refresh.
So this is the trade-off. For Control F5 fast, I can edit the controller and refresh the page. F5 is slower. I can't edit the controller and refresh the page, but I can put a breakpoint in the controller and I can examine all of my variables and I can slowly step through line by line and see exactly what's happening in my application. They're the two ways of running your application in Visual Studio, and they provide a lot of help.
Right. And Browser Link is that ability we saw when I was in Microsoft Edge. I can right-click, say, Inspect Element, and say, what line of code made that HTML?
Yeah, that's right.
All right, cool.
Cool.
Take a short break. We'll be right back here on the Microsoft Virtual Academy. Intro to ASP.NET.